Have you ever noticed how someone can go from replying instantly to suddenly disappearing like you never existed? And the scary part is, it rarely happens randomly something changed. And if you miss that shift, you will completely misread the situation and push them even further away, because silence is not always about losing interest. It is often a response to a subtle change in emotional experience that most people fail to notice in the moment. And this is where almost everyone gets it wrong. They focus on the last message they sent, instead of the pattern that was building before the silence even started, because attraction and engagement do not drop in a single moment. They fade through microsignals, shorter replies, delayed energy, less curiosity, and a gradual emotional pullback. And by the time the silence hits, the real reason has already passed unnoticed. Think about it like this: people do not suddenly wake up and decide to ignore someone. They respond to how interactions make them feel over time, and when those feelings shift even slightly, the behavior follows without warning. Maybe the conversation became predictable. Maybe it started to feel one-sided. Maybe there was a subtle pressure that made things feel less natural. Or maybe the emotional tension that kept things exciting quietly disappeared. And here's the part that most people never consider sometimes. It is not about doing something wrong. It is about doing too much of what felt right at the beginning, but no longer matches the current dynamic, because what creates attraction early on is not always what sustains it. And when you fail to adjust, you create a disconnect that the other person feels before you ever notice it. And instead of communicating it directly, they simply pull back, because silence is easier than explaining something they barely understand themselves. Now here is where things get even more interesting, because once the silence begins, your reaction becomes the real turning point. And this is where most people unintentionally make the situation worse. Not because they care too much, but because they respond from confusion instead of awareness. And you can almost predict the pattern. They start overthinking every message. They reread the conversation, looking for mistakes, and then they try to fix the silence by sending more messages, trying to restart the energy. But what they do not realize is that this shifts the dynamic even further, because it changes how they are perceived. Instead of someone who is engaging and interesting, they begin to look like someone seeking validation. And this subtle shift is powerful because attraction is deeply tied to emotional independence and perceived value. When someone feels that you need their response to feel okay, it creates pressure, and pressure quietly kills the natural flow that made things work in the first place. And here is the paradox: the more you try to bring back the connection directly, the more you highlight the absence of it, which makes the silence feel heavier on both sides. And what is even more fascinating is that people rarely lose interest instantly. They lose emotional momentum. And when that momentum drops, your job is not to chase it. Your job is to understand why it dropped in the first place. Because sometimes the silence is not a rejection. It is a test of emotional stability and awareness. Are you going to react impulsively, or are you going to hold your frame and give space for the dynamic to reset naturally? Because how you respond to silence often communicates more than anything you said before it. And this is where you finally gain control, not by forcing a reply, but by understanding what silence is really telling you and using it to your advantage. Because the moment you stop reacting emotionally and start observing patterns, you shift from being confused to being intentional. And that alone changes how you show up in every interaction going forward. So instead of sending another message trying to revive the conversation, you pause and ask yourself, what actually changed? Was the energy becoming predictable? Did I overinvest too quickly? Did I remove the mystery that kept things engaging, or did I ignore signs that they were slowly pulling back? Because when you answer these questions honestly, you stop taking silence personally and start seeing it as feedback, and feedback is power. Because now your next move is not driven by anxiety. It is driven by awareness, And that is what separates people who constantly get ignored from those who naturally re-attract attention. Without chasing, and here is the key insight, silence only has power over you. When you rush to fill it, but when you can sit in it comfortably, you create space for curiosity to come back. Because people are naturally drawn to what feels calm, grounded, and slightly unpredictable, and when you do decide to re-engage, you do it differently, not with a needy follow-up, but with a shift in tone, something lighter, something less attached, something that reflects that your world did not stop just because they stopped replying. And ironically, that is what often makes them respond again, because now the dynamic feels fresh instead of forced. And even if they do not reply, you still win because you protected your self-respect and learned how to read patterns instead of chasing outcomes. And that is the real skill most people never develop.